I'm continuing my series on the founding of America, talking about the Constitution, the constitutions of the states, the federal Constitution, the inscriptions. In this particular lesson and video, I want to talk about early Christian education, the education in the colonies, and the very, very early stages of the founding of the country. As we approach our country's 250th birthday, I think it's appropriate that we look back at where we were when we started as a nation and some of the controversies relative to what the original intent of the framers of the Constitution, those that signed the Declaration of Independence, those that formed our initial government. What was the intent of the type of nation that they were establishing? And I think the early education is going to give us an indication of what the status of the nation, what the culture and society was like back then, and gives us an idea of the roots and the foundation, obviously, of this nation. So let's take a look at education in America relative to our foundation, our roots, our heritage, etc. So educators down through the ages have understood the importance of controlling what was taught to the younger generation. We're going to look at that again later, but reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin uh, actually stressed education with an emphasis on biblical understanding and application. And the Protestant rebellion, the Reformation, was fostered by reading and interpreting the Bible as opposed to what was just basically the leveling of edicts from state churches and so forth. The Reformation, a lot of it was a push towards the populace, the laity, actually becoming more familiar with what the Bible actually said. So this understanding carried over to America at the earliest settlements, the colonies. Obviously, many of the earliest settlers, uh, the folks that came over, particularly from Europe, were obviously escaping the conditions of the state churches over there, and they were Protestants. From maybe a variety of different denominations, but they were Protestants. And so the roots of their religious faith were from, whether it's Luther, Calvin, or others of the reformers. And some of the earliest actions involved the establishments of schools and colleges. And as we'll see in a moment, all of these earliest institutions revolved around teaching both basic academics and the roots of Christian faith. In fact, in their mission statements, they specifically identified their missionary goals. Here's a quote from Henry May. From the beginnings, the expressed purpose of colonial education had been to preserve society against barbarism and so far as possible against sin. The inculcation of a saving truth was primarily the responsibility of the churches, but schools were necessary to protect the written means of revelation, obviously teaching reading and writing and so forth. So it kind of went hand in hand with what the churches were trying to instill in the children. Interestingly, the first textbook ever printed in America, called the New England Primer in 1690, obviously almost 200 years before I'm sorry, 100 years before the Revolutionary War. So this primer was being used well before that. And in teaching the ABCs, this primer, which was used for 200 years, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. B, better is a little fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therein. And so you can see C, D, E, Now, as they're teaching the alphabet, what they're doing is infusing, obviously, Christian morality and Christian scripture and so forth into these students. And again, this was one of the primary books that was used to teach the alphabet in schools in the colonies and then in the States. And in the back of this primer were a series of questions. What is the fifth commandment? What's forbidden in the fifth commandment? What's required in the sixth commandment? What's forbidden in the sixth commandment? So again, this was a primer. This was for beginners who were just learning how to read. Today, in our educational system, that would be first graders. I have a young grandson just learning to read. So he would have been back then, this primer would have been used to teach him how to read. And obviously these questions were posed in the back, which obviously are very religious in nature. In 1844, a school in Philadelphia indicated that it would begin teaching morality, but not religion. So morality separated from religion. And this case, when this was battled out in the courts, and it went to the Supreme Court, and this is what the Supreme Court said: why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the school, its general precepts expounded, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? Obviously, the Supreme Court ruling that the schools would teach Christianity and the Bible. So that this notion of separating morality from religion, they viewed as foolish. Now, what's interesting is that Bible reading and prayer were common and accepted in schools from the earliest settlements, from the time of the colonies through the establishment of the states and the state constitutions, the state governments, the federal government, and so forth, really until the middle of the 1900s, really for almost 200 years from the Declaration of Independence, more than that if you count the establishment, the settlements of the colonies. So you're talking really almost 300 years, basically, that this was widely accepted, that in schools that there would be Bible reading, that kids learning to read and so forth would read the Bible, that there would be prayer. And the primary influence in the public education system, unfortunately, today has become humanism, which is a system that places mankind above all things instead of God. Instead of God being the sovereign of all things, man is elevated to a position. Really, it's what you would call, what we would know as secularism. It's kind of driving religion and God out. The schools today are declared a governmental institution, and the notion of separation of church and state is then cited as a reason that all things that are religious in nature need to be expunged from the public schools. Now, I'm going to do an entire lesson, probably the next one, specifically talking about this notion of separation of church and state and where that actually came from. Obviously, if you've been following along in this lessons, more and more it should appear odd to you that there would be this notion that the establishment of this nation would have involved any idea of a separation of church and state, because there was such an infusion of religious faith, and particularly Christianity, in institutions from the beginning. And so, as we are today, we're now in the throes of a great struggle between the two worldviews: Christianity, which views God as the sovereign of all things that he has created, and humanism or secularism, which views man as the sovereign of all that has evolved up to this time. Now, according to the secularists or the humanists, man ought to be permitted to control history. And so, therefore, every vestige of Christianity is sought to be removed from as much of public life and public view as possible. In essence, trying to push it back to be something that is private. Yeah, practice it in your own home, practice it in your church, but don't bring it to the public square. Don't bring it to the political discourse. Certainly don't bring it into any governmental institution, which of course is completely foreign, a foreign idea when you consider what the original state constitutions, federal constitution, Declaration of Independence, and so forth established this nation to be. It's complete opposite. And the fact is that every humanist movement, from whether it's Marxism or Nazism to socialism, has recognized that the educational system is the key. The idea is obviously is to indoctrinate the next generation. And it was in 1962 that the Supreme Court delivered the ruling for the first time, which separated Christian principles from education. As I said before that, it was very common, regular even, that the Bible reading and prayer and so forth would be in church, in the public schools, not just the private schools, in the public schools. But in 1962, the Supreme Court struck down prayer in school. The original intent of the First Amendment was to prevent a national denomination, uh, but for the first time, the court now is interpreting it to mean any public religious activity. Uh, so this was a complete reinterpretation of the First Amendment. And this was the first Supreme Court case which offered not a single precedent to support their findings. Usually, obviously, they will go back to previous cases to defend their decisions. Obviously, in this case, in 1962, the Supreme Court did not do that. Why? Because they couldn't. How could you possibly, knowing what I've shared with you already relative to the beginnings of our nation, the roots of our culture, and so forth, there was really nothing in them that they could have drawn from, which would have given them the idea that the original intent of the First Amendment or anything in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or any official government document that would have given them the idea that the original intent was to scrub religious activity from the public square and from public education. Within a year of 1962, the Bible and religious classes and instruction were removed as well. And until then, as I said, it was the norm, basically. Now, in the case banning prayer, the court undertook a study, and this is interesting, which deemed that 97% of the public believed in God and would not be offended by the prayer that in question that was put before the court as being obviously that certain people were saying it was unconstitutional for this prayer to be recited in school. And we're going to look at that specific prayer in a minute. But when this was polled, 97% said there's nothing offensive in this prayer. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court sided with the 3% who did not believe and said they would be offended. 3%. And this was the first time in our nation's history that the minority position, here we are in a representative democracy, a republic in essence, really. But this was the first time in our history that the minority position became the rule for all. Here is the prayer that was debated in this case that went before the Supreme Court. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon thee, and we beg thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That's the prayer. Now, it doesn't mention Jesus. It's not specifically a Christian prayer at all. It mentions God only one time, which is interestingly the same number of times that God is invoked in the Pledge of Allegiance. And God is mentioned 1/4 as many times as in the Declaration of Independence that established us as a nation. And yet it was declared, that prayer was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And what was the result? Well, since 1962, when God was in essence kicked out of the public schools, birth rates for girls aged 10 to 14 have risen over 500%, which obviously also a drastic increase in sexually transmitted disease. And by every moral measure, basically, we have declined and deteriorated morally. If you look at a graph, incidences of these things was very steady, was very steady, was very steady for decades, decades and decades and decades. And then suddenly in 1962, it just started to spike and has climbed really to this day. Divorce skyrocketed beginning in 1963, the year after this, and tripled in the next 18 years. In fact, the United States now leads the world in the rate of divorce. There was a rise in single parent families, and unmarried couples living together rose staggeringly in that time. Obviously the sexual revolution of the late 60s took place not long after that. It was obviously a lot happened immediately after the court declared that God, you're no longer welcome in the public schools. Prior to 1963, there had never been two consecutive years in which SAT scores had declined amongst our students. Well, after 1963, SAT scores fell for 18 consecutive years. Not long ago, the Department of Education declared that ours, is the first generation who knows less than their parents. There was an average of an 80-point difference in the SAT scores of the generations, despite the fact that the test was basically the same. So we can't say that the reason was, for some reason, that the test itself changed. Here's a quote from Time magazine. For God to be kept out of the classroom or out of America's public debate by nervous school administrators or overcautious politicians serves no one's interests. That restriction prevents people from drawing on this country's rich and diverse religious heritage for guidance, and it degrades the nation's moral discourse by placing a whole realm of theological reasoning out of bounds. The price of that sort of quarantine at a time of moral dislocation is and has been far too high. Now, I don't know exactly when that quote was published in Time, probably not particularly recently, but not all that long ago. Now, this is going to be interesting, I believe, to you, but what about colleges? As we've seen with education throughout history, education that throughout history has been the primary means to transform a society. This is a quote, whoever controls the schools will set the goals for the nation, establish its religious values, and ultimately control the future. Now, this is an old quote, and this is one of the reasons why one of the first acts of the colonies, was to establish colleges in addition to just elementary schools and high schools and so forth. Almost all of the colleges established in the colonies were designed to teach Christian precepts. One of the interesting things, I'm here living right outside Philadelphia. One of the exceptions was the University of Pennsylvania, which was founded in 1755. But let's take a look at many of the others: Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, Princeton, King's College, which became Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth. Most of these Ivy League. And they were, of course, in these variety of colonies, as you see in the second column, or the third column rather, and then the last one. They were each affiliated with a particular Christian denomination at their founding. Harvard, the first college that was chartered, before Harvard, 19 years Prior to Harvard being chartered, there was a Henricus College in Virginia. Its mission was, quote, for the training and bringing up of infidels, children, to the true knowledge of God and understanding of righteousness, obviously a theological education. Now, this mission was consistent with all the colonial colleges, I should say most of the colonial colleges, as we will see. Now let's look at Harvard. In 1636, Harvard was chartered and started by John Eliot, who was described as the apostle to the Indians. Harvard was named for John Harvard, who donated his library to the college. Quote, one of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. So kind of the next generation of ministers, that's what Harvard was established to prepare. Entry into Harvard required a knowledge of Greek and Latin. It required a commitment to Jesus Christ and a belief the Bible was the foundation for truth. Rules and precepts given to the students included, quote, everyone shall so exercise himself in reading the scriptures twice a day. The main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ. Harvard clearly established to provide a Christian education. The curriculum at Harvard emphasized study of biblical languages, logic, divinity, or theology, and communication skills like public speaking and rhetoric. Rhetorical skills, obviously, if you're going to turn out ministers giving sermons and so forth, they needed to do this. 52% of the 17th century graduates, those that came out in the 1600s, became ministers. Half of the graduates of Harvard in those first decades became ministers. And of course, it basically said that was their intent, was to turn out prepared, literate, effective ministers. Now, Yale was established in 1701, decades after Harvard. It was established because some felt that Harvard was not being as true to its original mission at that point in time. Yale's founders required the Westminster Confession, which is a rich theological confession of the Christian faith, and it had to be studied by all students. It described its mission: every student shall consider the main end of his study, to wit, to know God in Jesus Christ, and answerably to lead a godly, sober life. Obviously, again, established for a rich theological education. King's College, established in 1754 by Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson was a theologian and a philosopher, and he was a Yale grad. He established this new King's College. Now, he aligned with the Anglican Church, but he promised there is no intention to impose on the scholars the peculiar tenets of any particular sect of Christians, but to inculcate upon their tender minds the great principles of Christianity and morality, in which true Christians of each denomination are generally agreed. And King's College, as you can see, later became Columbia. So the idea here was, just as in so many of the colonies, and then after they became states in their constitutions, that we are going to have freedom of religion. We are not going to impose a particular denominational Christianity on the populace. We're not going to declare a particular denomination to be the state religion. But there's going to be a definitive preference for supporting and spreading, if you will, teaching the Christian faith. And King's College, which of course became Columbia, is no exception. William and Mary, founded in 1693. It was begun also with an evangelical Christian purpose. It was established in response to an act from 1662 by the Assembly of Virginia. Quote, the want of able and faithful ministers in this country deprives us of those great blessings and mercies that always attend upon the services of God for the advancement of learning, education of youth, supply of the ministry, and promotion of piety. Obviously, also looking to prepare men in this particular case to be ministers or others who are propagating the Christian faith. Duke, founded in 1924. We're getting much more recent, just about 100 years ago. Here, from the original bylaws of Duke, the aims of Duke University are to assert a faith in the eternal union of knowledge and religion set forth in the teachings and character of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. How much more explicitly Christian could it be? These are in the bylaws at Duke University when it was established a little over 100 years ago. Higher education for hundreds of years in this country was clearly entwined with Christianity. Schools were established in the colonies to maintain and advance Christianity. I hope that this has demonstrated that. Quote, the schools were intended to form Christian men, Christian citizens, and Christian ministers, not as a byproduct, but directly. They were instruments of the church, which was, at least in the beginning, virtually coterminous with the community. Education was an enterprise undertaken primarily in the interests of religion, with religion, of course, defined in terms of the Calvinist orthodoxy then dominant in New England, end quote. Again, the schools in the colonies and in the states, and really up until 1962, largely were promoting the Christian faith and largely promoting the Reformed Christian faith. But in 1962, of course, all that changed. Now, in time, there were colleges and institutions that began to be formed and funded by wealthy entrepreneurs for decidedly different reasons than religion. Of course, these universities, these colleges, these institutions were begun, financed, and so forth, and chartered, if you will, for secular purposes. For example, Cornell, started by Ezra Cornell, primarily was established as an institution to teach telegraph and banking. Johns Hopkins for banking and railroads. Cornelius Vanderbilt, obviously Vanderbilt University for steamships and railroads. Stanford railroads. Duke tobacco, and so forth. I should say that those are the areas in which these men made their fortunes, and they are the ones who started these universities and did not do so quite so much, at least, on the basis of religion. Science more and more was viewed as the source of all truth. And of course, this is something that we see in today's world relative to the educational system. I think it's pretty clear that the original intentions, at least, of education in the colonies and then in the United States and the individual states was certainly vastly different than the system that we have today, which obviously has come to us from the actions of the Supreme Court, primarily beginning in 1962, where religion was all but scrubbed clean, from the at least from public education. Schools and colleges have traveled a long way down the road of secularism. You look at the original charters of many of the Ivy League schools, as we looked at, and of course look at their mission today. They would not even recognize really if dusted off and looked at their original bylaws. Um, it's interesting, though, that there are inscriptions, on some of the buildings and so forth in some of these colleges and universities that still exist, but the, the mission of those colleges today is a far cry from what they were originally. So the clash of worldviews between faith-based and secular uh, points of view will continue to rage in the classroom just as it does in the public square, because ultimately the two worldviews are incompatible. And so, again, there will be those who will fight the notion that there should be any infusion, mention, suggestion that God should be a subject to be discussed in the public square, in the political arena, etc. I know we've seen where Supreme Court uh, justice candidates are berated because they have too strong a faith. We've seen that. We've seen just recently a senator, who was flabbergasted that a witness in a hearing suggested that our rights come from God and not the government. And this senator from Virginia was astonished that somebody would say such a thing. But of course, I believe that senator, particularly since he was from Virginia, should have read the document that was largely drafted by Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, the Declaration of Independence, where he specifically states that our rights come from our Creator, capital C. Interesting that it was a senator from Virginia who seemed to not understand and be shocked that someone would suggest that our rights come from God. Anyway, I hope you have found this to be interesting. I hope you found this to be helpful. In the next video, the next lesson, what I want to do is look at specifically at the issue of the separation of church and state. Where did that come from? It's not a phrase that you will not find it in the Constitution. You will not find it in the Declaration of Independence. You will not find it in any state constitution. You will not find it where you will find it, of course, today. It's quoted over and over again. But where did it originate from? If it wasn't in any of our founding documents, where did that come from? And what was its original intent? And how is it being used today? I hope you'll look for that video. In the meantime, thank you for watching this one.